All right, welcome everybody. Happy Thursday. It is the second Thursday of the month, so welcome to Intermediate Cameras. I'm your host, Saxon, as always. Welcome. I started a couple minutes late, my apologies. I don't have any students present with me today, so it's just me. So give it a few more seconds here. I'll let people sign in, get going, and then we'll jump into it. But today is Intermediate Cameras. So we'll be going through that in a little bit here. Anybody who has questions, as always, go ahead and chat on the right side. I am by myself, so I get a little sleepy on these days. I'm going to grab a water bottle in just a second here. But yeah, we'll get started in a little bit. Thanks for joining me today. Alright, well, we gave it a couple more minutes here. Let's jump into it, everybody. Again, welcome. My name is Saxon. I'm the host. I teach this every week of every month, except for a couple weeks there in the month. First, the second, and the last Thursday of every month are our camera classes. The first Thursday is our basic. Today, our second Thursday is our intermediate, and then our last Thursday of the month is going to be drones. So let's jump into it now that we've got a couple viewers here. Thanks for everybody who's on. So to start off, why do we go advanced point and shoot, DSLR, or mirrorless? We live in a beautiful age where we have cell phones. Our cell phones are very strong. They have good cameras. I have the iPhone 14 Pro, so I've got 3 cameras on the back of mine. You know, why do we need a mirrorless, a DSLR, or point and shoot? And I think the real way to sum it up is the phone's camera is great. It's only so powerful. When you look at a camera, especially nowadays, the camera is dictated by its mirror or by its sensor size. You can get a 1-inch sensor. You can get a 3/4 sensor. You can get a crop sensor. That's the ASP-C. You can get a full frame sensor. You can get a wide format sensor. There's many different ones available. When we take a picture with our phone, we're capturing a good image. Again, depending on the model that we have. But when we try to send that or give that to somebody else, it gets pixelated via transfer. The image size itself is contained to a certain size. You can't really go too big with one of those photos, otherwise it'll blur. Same thing with zoom. When you try to zoom with your phone, it blurs. Going with a point and shoot, a DSLR, or a mirrorless is a way of basically getting away from your cell phone's camera, giving yourself something that's more powerful, has better resolution quality, can zoom or go a wide angle without losing any image quality or resolution. That's what you're paying for when you get yourself a dedicated camera, whether that's the handheld point and shoot, no interchangeable lenses, whether that's DSLR, the more old school way of digital photography, or whether that's mirrorless, the more modern sense of photography. Mirrorless has been around for almost 20 years now at this point. But regardless, going more advanced should acquaint to better pictures, better resolution, better quality, the ability to blow images up and make them much bigger, put them in print publications. You know, if you've got friends and family for a wedding, You know, the reason you see a professional photographer walking around with a camera and not their cell phone isn't because the cell phone won't cut it, or sorry, isn't because they want to look fancy. It's because the bigger camera will take the better image. And the bride and groom, whoever it is, the guest, they'll have much more, they'll have a much more high quality image than with their phone. So going more advanced basically is going to give you an equate to better images, better quality. Now, getting into it, let's talk about the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. When I think of a snapshot, we think of a quick image. We think of a quick thing when you're pulling out your phone or your camera and you're really not thinking, you're just taking a picture. Might be for reference for later. Maybe you like the colors of something. Maybe you just like the shapes and how things were laid out. You know, maybe it was just more stylistic. Maybe you're trying to figure out how you want to do a photo shoot later on. A snapshot's a great way to get an image, get a quick, solid image without needing to really stress yourself out about finer details. This would be a great picture maybe to send to a friend if they were like, oh, where are you at in the store? You take a picture of the escalator. Boom, people would know. Now a photograph has more detail, has more thought, has more process. Both of these photos were taken at the same time of day, and both photos were taken in the same exact location. We can see that with the photograph, we have more complexity to the colors, the yellow, the blue from the sky, the purple that hits off of the stainless steel that radiates back towards us. Those are all bits and pieces that basically make the photograph more interesting and pleasing to look at. We have lines that are counteracting or concending, if you will. They're coming into a certain point. They're parallel to each other. We have this kind of nice color scheme that is different colors of warm and dark tones or warm and cold tones, but it all looks like it blends together. Whereas we have something a little more true to life, not as much razzle-dazzle, if you will, but it gets the message across. So again, a snapshot is a quick image. It's meant to be more of a starting point for maybe something larger that you're working on. And a photograph is really the big thing, is the better quality, is the thing that's thought out. Color is there, imaging is there. There's a way that you're going about it that gives much more, I want to say oomph or realism to it, if it makes sense. So step one, the first thing I tell everybody is learn your camera. I use this picture as a perfect example. There's so many different cameras out there, and it's really hard when I get customers who want to know just about their camera, because when you think about it, there's probably over 100 cameras out there that are being manufactured on a regular basis when you combine everything from Canon, Nikon, Sony, the big three. Then you throw in Panasonic, you throw in Blackmagic, you throw in Fujifilm, you throw in Olympus film, you throw in GoPros even, drones. I mean, there's so many different cameras out there. The first thing you should be doing, if you haven't, is take my intro class. The intro class, I give a really easy, brief breakdown of understanding your camera, getting to know button layouts, everything else. If you've already done that, read your manual. The manual that comes with your camera tells you everything you need to know. Will you understand all of it? That depends. But I definitely can't stress enough how important it is to start by reading the manual to learn your cameras. Knowing where buttons are, knowing where things exist on the camera, being able to feel comfortable enough that you can go from menu to menu, not necessarily knowing what's in all of the menus, but knowing how to navigate the camera is really important, and it really helps in the long run of things, especially as we get into more advanced intermediate things. So you've learned your camera, you know where buttons are. We talked about SD cards to start the class last time. That was the kind of intro we had with the class. We talked about the SD card, what you should be looking at for SD cards, what you should know about those. Let's talk about images and the quality of images that we have. So you have a RAW and a JPEG, or RAW or JPEG, or both. Cameras nowadays, for the most part, give you a couple different options for saving the image. You can save the image as a RAW or as a JPEG. or you can save them as both. Now, for the average user, a JPEG is more than enough. JPEG is your standard file, doesn't do anything crazy. It compresses all of the different layers that the photo gets, and you're getting a flat, compressed image, if you will. Now, the robustness, the color, the saturation, the hue, all of that stuff can be changed and altered through Photoshop. You yourself can also sit there and bump things up on the camera and tweak. So those are manipulative, if you will. You can manipulate those factors on the photo, even if the file is compressed, like with a JPEG. RAW files give you the ability to really do more editing and more work to the photo, if you will. If we think of a or we think of a JPEG being a flat, compressed file, this would be the JPEG, right? If we think of a RAW, this would be the RAW. There's layers and there's complexities to that image file and the way that it's saved. So when you go to change things, you can change things up and it'll basically alter or edit one part of the photo, not the whole grand scheme of things, because it's not all compressed. So if we start, we look at our RAW. The RAW photo looks very washed out, looks dark, it looks very light, sandy is even something students have said before. You don't really get a good shine off the guitar. That doesn't look necessarily that nice. And overall, his face looks like it's falling into the background. We move to the JPEG, and the face isn't falling into the background nearly as much anymore, but the shirt looks darker. The hair kind of looks pixelated in a way. It doesn't look correct. Color-wise, we've got shadow on the arm, which is really nice. We can see the wrinkles in the shirt, but still, there's just something not quite there. The process RAW looks the best out of the three. We can see his arm clearly, it's defined. There's no part of the arm except for maybe where the elbow is that blends in with the photo, so we can clearly dictate where his arm and where the background is. His cheeks have more coloration and darkness right here with his beard hair, so you can really see the cheeks. The folds in the shirt are much more pronounced. The guitar strap is darker. You can see that by processing the RAW and going through and editing that photo, we're able to clean the image up and make it look a lot nicer. And by doing that, we're giving it more shine, more life, if you will. So looking at a JPEG or a RAW, if you're brand new to photography and you're just getting into the intermediate now because you've really understood the automatic setting and you understand all the very things we talk about in the basic class, JPEG is probably where you're going to start and what you've been shooting on. Now, going from JPEG, the RAW would be the next thing to look at. And RAW I really only recommend if you're someone who's interested in Photoshop. Are you someone who likes to sit and fiddle with something and for a couple hours or so, you want to be able to play with the darknesses and the lightness, and you want to make sure that the image really looks as true to life as possible? Then a RAW would probably be the best way to go. Processing that RAW would then be the next move. That way you get the most complexity out of your photo, you get the most detail, you get the most information. JPEG though still works really well. And some people don't notice too big of a difference between the JPEG and the process RAW. I can, because I've taught this class so many times and I've seen these photos so many times that I do know the difference. But for most people, JPEGs are fine. If you're someone who's trying to get more advanced with their photography and you're trying to move into more of a professional realm, RAW is what you're going to hear and see the most or majority of your time in your work. Now currently online there's many different editing softwares that you can look into for photos. When we talk about RAWs and JPEGs, you wouldn't want to take a RAW if you were, you wouldn't want to take a RAW photo if you weren't editing any of this stuff. If you were just going to send the pictures as is to wherever you're going, take them as a JPEG. There really won't be any issues with that. If you want to edit your photos and make them look a certain way, then definitely do RAW. You'll get more advantage out of editing and everything else. And as far as editing software goes, these are some examples of what you can use. If you're doing stuff like video, you have DaVinci. And DaVinci's a great source because you really can play with the levels of the photos. You can play with the saturation. You can edit things, but it also acts as a movie editor too. A lot of people who ask about editing films or editing photos into a slideshow-based film, and DaVinci would be a great option to do that. You have Flickr underneath. I believe it's Flickr. I could be wrong. I've heard that symbol is owned by Microsoft. I know that it stands for layers of a photo, so I know it has the photo editing abilities. But that's another example of something that with a raw photo you get a lot more flexibility and a lot more that you can do. With a JPEG you're limited on your editing. And then you have Photoshop. Photoshop's your standard, your run-of-the-mill. Everybody loves it. Adobe makes it. They have the Creative Cloud, which is what I really like about Photoshop, because you not only get to have all of these different apps that you can then use to edit and play with your images, your drawings, etc. You also have access to their online gallery, and then you also have access to their community. So you can post anything that you like, share your work, people can comment on it and critique and give feedback. So it's definitely a great tool if you're a photographer who's like, I want my peers to judge my work because I want to know what works and what doesn't work for the way that I make art. That's something I don't think we get enough out of in life as artists, is the ability to sit there and listen to people's feedback and understanding of our work. Not everything that we take a picture of is going to be beautiful. Not everything we paint is going to be beautiful. But the goal is to make sure that we learn something by what we're doing. So if you're planning on doing any type of raw photo, you're going to want to edit. If you don't want to edit, shoot in JPEG. Now I talked about this in the last class, but we have the dial mode. The dial mode toggles between all the different modes on the physical camera, and there's multiple ways that you can go about it. Today we'll be talking about a couple of the different modes. Last class we only talked about the automatic dial. Automatic's great because as a photographer, as someone who's getting into it, you have the ability to take a photo and not set anything on the physical camera. You don't have to sit there and make sure that the aperture, the shutter, any of that stuff is correct, because the camera will do it all for you. But as a photographer, we want to break away from using automatic. The whole fun part about the camera is our control, is our manipulation over the camera, is the fact that when we point it towards something, we can change the way that it interacts and understands light. We can change it so that way it takes the image the way we want it to take the image, whether we're editing it, not editing it, sending it to friends, posting it on Facebook, putting it into a card. There's all sorts of ways to go about it, and the mode dial is our driving factor for the camera's brains to do what we're telling it to do. So automatic, we talked about that. That means the camera does all the work for you. Program auto means you program what you want to be automatic. Everything else then is up to you. Aperture priority only controls the aperture, and everything else goes to auto. Shutter priority only controls the shutter, and everything else goes to auto. And then there's full manual. Full manual, you control everything, you do everything, it's yours. I like full manual only because you have the real ability as a photographer to sit there and say, okay, my light doesn't look good there, let me turn my ISO up. The object I'm taking pictures of is really moving, let me raise my shutter speed up. And then it's dark, it's overcast, let me move it towards this number over here. The beauty of it all is that you're able to do that in full manual, and it can be overwhelming at first, and I usually don't recommend people who've never shot a camera to go to manual. Stick with automatic. Once you feel comfortable, come on over to this video, and then that's where you can learn a little bit more about this stuff. So this is the nitty-gritty of our presentation. This probably takes the longest out of all my presentations, so everyone please bear with me on this. I'll be as thorough and as quick as possible, and then we'll get into some examples. So the exposure triangle, let me get a good stretch. I tell you, when there's nobody sitting in front of me and it's just me talking into an empty room, I can feel the yawns, so I apologize. The exposure triangle is one of the most important rules and guidelines in all of cameras. This has been used since, I would say, film. The exposure triangle, if you were to go like this with your hand and make a triangle, consists of 3 parts. Let's say on the left side, your right, my left, you have your aperture. On the bottom you would have ISO, and on the top you would have shutter. those are representative of three separate things the camera needs to be set properly with in order to make sure that it's getting the best photo possible. Aperture is going to control your foreground to background relationship. Shutter is going to control the movement or the speed at which the shutters close and open. And then your ISO is going to dictate the amount of light that's in the room. The camera itself will search for more light, pull that in, illuminate the image more. By doing that, it's going to naturally turn the photo grainy depending on your ISO. So it's another thing to keep in mind. Starting with aperture though. Here we have background to foreground separation. Now it might not be much when we're looking at this, but background to foreground separation is important for a multitude of different reasons. As a photographer, let's just say you're not even being a photographer, you're on vacation with the family. Let's say you go to Egypt and you're like this little stick figure, you're in front of the pyramids. You'd want to make sure that the pictures you're taking include the pyramids behind you, because why would you want to take a photo of something like the pyramids with the family and not have proof that you visited? You'd want to use something like an f/22 or an f/16 where the background and the person are visible. But now let's say you're in front of your local city dump. You left something in the couch cushion, you threw the couch away, you're like, oh gosh, we gotta go. You go to the dump, you find your item, now you're standing in front of the big fence, and for some godforsaken reason, you're like, let's take a group family picture. You don't want the dump necessarily to be in the photo with you. So in that case, you'd want to go to your lowest f-stop possible. Now, on most traditional lenses, you're going to see an f-stop of usually about 4 to 5.66. That's the scale at which the lens will move through its f-stops at the lowest. Typically, what that means is when you're starting at 18 millimeter, and let's say you move up, it'll go from 2.8 to 3. Then once you get past, let's say this is a 18 to 400 millimeter lens. Let's say once you get up to like 300, it then turns into a 6. Basically, the glass inside the camera can only do so much in order to separate the background and the foreground. What is this? This is intermediate cameras. So we're talking just camera knowledge going through. Right now we're talking about aperture, we're talking about the f-stop, we're talking about how depending on the number that you're setting your f-stop to, it'll dictate the background to foreground separation. So hopefully that answers your question for what this is. So with an f1.4, you're going to completely blur the background out and not have anything. With the f-stop of 22, which on most cameras is the highest you can go, you're going to get the full background and the full foreground. So let's again say that you're on vacation and you're in front of the pyramids. Using an f/22 and f/16, that's probably going to be the best option because you'll get the picture of the kids and the family plus the pyramid in the background. You're at the city dump though, and you just want to get a nice picture of the kids. You don't want to focus on the background at all. Going to the lowest number that you physically can on the lens that you have provided, so whether that's a 1.4 or 2 or a 1.8, those would be the lowest numbers that you see on a majority of the higher end cameras. You can do that, and then that should help you blur the background out. But let's say that you don't necessarily need too much blur, but you just don't want to see the background. You can go lower, you can go f8, f5.6, whatever the lowest number is. You don't have to stay at that number. You can always go higher. Typically cameras though will check out at about f/22. I haven't seen anything higher than that. Some examples of aperture priority. If we look at the dog's nose, we can easily say that there's blur going on in the background there. We've got this up-close picture of a snoot. We see the dog in the background, but the dog's blurry. So if we go back to my other slide, we're most likely looking at something of either f8 or f5.6, where you can make out the shapes of the pyramids and you know what those are, but you don't necessarily see them in full clarity. So for example, we look at the dog in the background, we can clearly tell that's a dog, but we can't see that dog clearly. And by clearly, I mean the pupils of its eyes, the hair on its face, the whiskers, all that stuff. That's all hidden by the blurriness of the photo. On the right side, we've got our squirrel with a nut. The squirrel's eating, they're in perfect clarity, but we see that the background is blurry except for maybe one piece of the branch that's hanging from the front of the squirrel's head. That's mostly an f2.8 or maybe an f4. It's low because you don't have that much background to foreground separation, but it's not, sorry, it's low because you have all that background to foreground separation. You could see the greenery though, so you know it's got to be foliage just because of the fact that it's on a log in the tree. You just don't know where. Another example, in this case we have background being so blurred that we have an effect called bokeh. Bokeh are the dots. Most likely what's behind this little Lego figure are Christmas lights. The Christmas lights are then set in such a way that when the aperture is turned all the way to that 1.4, 1.8, it'll blur the background out enough that you can't see it, but because those lights are so strong and that's our main source of light, it comes through it as these little circles of light. That's called bokeh. So why use something like aperture priority? And I use this picture as my example. This picture, you can see there's little to no blur behind the figure, and this would be a great example why. When you have photos and you have settings where, let's say, the light and everything else that's coming through is powerful, it's strong, but then on top of that you have a background or a foreground that's very pretty, gorgeous, and you want to make sure you incorporate both using your aperture priority mode on the camera. So when we go back to the mode dial, so M is full manual, A is automatic, S is shutter speed, and then, or I apologize, auto is automatic. A or AV is going to be your aperture priority, and then you're going to see, oh gosh, I'm forgetting. Auto, aperture, shutter, manual. Oh, and program. You're going to see program. And we talked about the program already, and we mentioned this in a class prior, so I won't get too into detail with it. But in this case, we're doing shutter priority. So S or TV is what we're looking for. I haven't figured out what TV means exactly yet, but I have been asked before. It's on my list of things to research. Using the TV or the A on the camera, you are basically, A or AV is for aperture. Using one of those will basically allow for you to set the camera in such a way where you can only focus on the foreground and background relationship. If you're using full manual, you'll get to control all three of them, so I don't really have anything to say to you there. You have to control ISO, aperture, and shutter. But I like aperture priority mode because sometimes I am in a spot where the color, everything else is fine for my camera to handle. But now there's something about the background and foreground relationship that it's just not picking up. Maybe the auto sensor isn't going, the autofocus points aren't kicking in, and the camera's not tracking right. The aperture priority would be a great way for you to make sure that you are capturing the background and the foreground, or just blurring out that foreground or the background completely and focusing on the foreground, or vice versa, blurring out the foreground, focusing on the background. The reason I like this photo so much is because we have an interesting background, water, a waterfall, or a beach, and then you have this beautiful city all the way in the background. It just looks refreshing, it looks nice, and it looks a lot nicer than if you were to blur out that background, so that way we wouldn't be able to see what was behind her if we only just saw this part, a little bit of water. I don't think it would have held as much weight or looked as nice. It's another way to think when you're trying to take photos is that composition, correct? And how when we're taking photos, especially in aperture priority or in full manual, we want to make sure that we are cognizant or aware of our surroundings as we shoot. When I say shoot through the photo during my intro class, what I'm trying to tell students to do is to not be afraid to take the picture in its entirety, not just one section of the photo. And with aperture priority, I feel like we have the opportunity because we can have moving objects at different speeds, but we want to make sure that we get those in the most proper way possible. So to review, we have, if you have two objects coming at the same speed, it's more of a shutter speed. But the aperture would be important too on that one. It doesn't matter which one's in the foreground or the background. It just comes down to how we want to blur the background in accordance to the foreground, or if we want to do that at all. Anyway, using this as my reference sheet, 32 is the highest you can go, not 22, so I apologize. But we'll look at the first one on the left, the F32. We can clearly see the blue dumpster. We can clearly see the wood on the tree. We can see the brush in the back. We can see the grass and then the body of water. F16 starts to get a little rougher. Now we are starting to blur everything out. Things are getting harder to see. F6.3 even harder now. And at 2.8 you really can't see the background at all. You can kind of make out what's there, but as far as a dumpster is concerned, you really can't see it. Now let's talk about shutter. A lot of people like to talk to me about shutter. This is their favorite concept. The idea behind shutter is that when you're taking a photo, the faster those shutters close, the more information, or the less information the camera is able to absorb. The slower they close, the more information. Now there's a problem with using the ones that go faster. When you're using the shutter speeds that go faster, you have to keep in mind the ability your camera has as it concerns itself with your movements, your shaking. Naturally, if you were to put your hand out and hold it, you're going to start to notice that your hand tremors a little bit. It's just natural. I've only met a few people who can hold a very steady hand, but as I'm getting older, I draw, I do a lot of different art stuff. I can definitely see my hands and fingers moving a lot more than they should. When you're using a camera, that kind of thing can affect what you're doing. So longer shutter speeds with the camera in your hands are usually a big no-no. Typically what people like to do is they use tripods or monopods in order to capture this. But you can do it any sort of way, even if you just are putting the camera on the table and then pushing the trigger while it's there too. The faster that we move the shutter speed, the faster it'll close, but the more likely of a chance that we're closing too early and we're missing that subject matter, or when we put our shutter speed higher, the amount of light that's coming in is less. Those are both factors that can come in. So what we need to be thinking about with this is how fast is our subject matter moving to us. For a majority, I would say 1 in 125ths or 1 in 250ths is more than enough. I probably use that the most out of the bunch. 1/60th is okay too. Those are for me when I'm just taking photos of everyday stuff. Oh man, I need more people in class. I would say yeah. 1 250th, 101 and 1/125th. I hate fractions. I always hate talking like this. 1 in a 60th of a second. Those are the words I'm looking for. Those are typically what I'm using. It's all dependent on, again, what I'm taking pictures of. But to give you some context, when you have things that are in motion, things that are fast, like the surfer, 1 in 1,000th of a second is going to be your freezing action shot. You have that, you got good ISO turned on. When you take this photo, you should be able to capture something like this, but remember that you're going very quick with this, so we have to compensate with certain numbers and certain things in the camera. With this one though, we see the surfer, we see the water coming up as they're going through with it. It looks clean, it looks well put together. The thing I like the most about this image is the fact that there is little to no blurring around the water. The image or the gentleman himself that flipped out of the water looks very, what's the term I'm looking for? In focus and detailed. And on top of that too, we're not really getting a lot of haziness from the physical water, which is something that we can't experience because the water's consistently moving. So that will look blurry in the photo, but there being so much of this water traveling at the speed that it's traveling in, we're able to get a lot more of that detail on both the water and the surfer. Motion's a big part of this. When we have motion in the photo, we're giving a sense of urgency, we're giving a sense of movement, and for a lot of people, that sense of movement is really exciting. It's fun. It's different from the majority of the photos that we're seeing. A little bit of blur doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. In this case, we've got this woodpecker, and the body of the woodpecker and the beak are in perfect stillness. The wings have a slight blur to them. That slight blur that we're seeing on the wings is coming from the fact that that bird is moving so fast. So using a shutter speed of 1 1/1000th of a second, even if you're maybe, let's say, 1 12/50ths of a second, so 1/1250, 1 12/50th, saying those numbers out loud always confuse me. That would be another great option to use. The idea is that we're giving it such a speed on the shutter that we're allowing for the camera to close fast enough to capture a still slice of this bird. The body and the yellow and the color from the bird is gorgeous. The brown wings and the featheration or the feathering on there probably isn't the most exciting thing that we need to see. It's there, it's available to us. But I'd say that color from the bird is the sharpest part and the thing that we're the most interested in this case. So shutter, control over the shutter is great to give a few different things, to give the sense of motion, to give freezing action so we don't so we can capture that finer detail in something as like action-packed as surfing. And shutter can be used for a lot of different things that we're going to go through and talk with some examples as well too. Something else I like about shutter is the idea that you can create long exposures with shutter. So creating mood with long exposures is exciting, it's fun. There is a setting on most cameras that you'll see, and I wonder if I go back a couple slides, if I have that on the mode dial. So it's something they've gotten rid of in the past, and I've seen it. You really can get this in the shutter setting nowadays. They've moved it. There used to be a setting on the cameras called B for bulb. And B for bulb was simple. You had, back in the day, with your cameras, you would have a camera, so you'd have your camera, and then you'd have this kind of tray thing that you were holding in your hands. When you would take the picture, this tray would shoot this powder in the air, and that powder would ignite and flash. And that was how it brought light to your image. And they called that the bulb. In then the later years, and like let's say that was maybe late 1800s, early 1900s is when they're using the flash powder. They eventually craft, when more commercial light bulbs become available, flash bulbs. Flash bulbs were this little blue ball that would go into the little socket of your flash on your camera. Basically there was an arm, would lock onto the camera, so you had the camera, then you had this little arm that would come up with a little light bulb on the inside. When you take that picture, the bulb would flash, and you'd hear this really loud pop noise, because you only get one flash out of the bulb, or a couple flashes from the bulb, and then it would hit the image or hit the target and give enough light. the bulb, in the sense, the B, would stay open for a long time. And it would basically stay open for as long as you were holding it. So way back in the day, before they were really able to get the exposure settings on a camera right, or the shutter speed on the camera right, you would hold that sucker down until you were good and then let go. Long exposures then kind of were created out of this. A long exposure basically means that your shutter is going to stay open for a prolonged period of time, longer than a second, let's say, longer than 1/100th of a second, which when we think about 1/100th of a second, that's not a lot of time, but that's a lot of time for the camera to be open and then you to have some kind of jiggle or things to get blurry. With long exposure, because we're keeping it open for so long, we absolutely need a tripod to do this. If you try to do long exposure without a tripod, you're never going to quite get it, and every photo you take is going to look a little too blurry. But now, something like this waterfall, we definitely have our camera set up on a tripod. The camera is set up in such a way where it's going to have the bulb open the entire time, or have their shutters open for a prolonged period of time before closing. When you look at the photo, you can see how intense the green is. You can see the shadows in the rocks, the moss, the folds, the different vines that are growing. Under the rocks, you see or under the water, you see the rocks of the waterfall. You see the formation that it has. You see haziness on the water. And the water is the one part that I would say looks the most blurry out of this. But what we're seeing, or what we're getting out of this, is the fact that we have a very saturated image, we have a lot of detail, we have a lot of color. Because we have all of that, we get more information, and it might be more appealing to your viewer or to you as the photographer. You're going to see motion on the water because the water's in constant motion the whole time. The water, though, will still look pretty uniform because while the water's kind of doing its own thing, the water falls in a path. The water is naturally going down this waterfall the same way that it's probably been doing for the last couple hundred years as the water's eroding the rocks and forming the channels, etc., etc. But again, you're going to see a lot of detail, a lot of color, a lot of shadow, hue, saturation in the rock formations, the greenery, everything. You're going to notice more of the blurriness in the physical water where it's consistently moving, and it's moving at a pace that is kind of erratic or spontaneous. Long exposures are great. You have to have a tripod or at least something to set the camera down. If it's in your hand, you will get shakiness, you will get motion. Another example of a long exposure, in this case we have a gentleman who's biking. They most likely set it up on a tripod, or this is a train station, so maybe they set it up on a bench of the train. The camera's set to that B or long exposure setting, and what I love about this image is that the platform, the roof, the bike, the bikeist or cyclist, or the random person are all perfectly still, and we can see all of those. The long exposure that took place here, those all look good because those stayed in the same spot the entire time. The train, on the other hand, is moving, zipping back and forth. When it's moving like that, we see the wisps of light that are on a train. You know, if you ride CTA, if you ride Metra, Amtrak, you're on the Zephyr, whatever train system that you're familiar with, all trains have lights on the outside of trains to give notification that it's moving, that it's in transit, etc. So those lights, because they're not perfectly still, kind of come across as a light kind of, I don't even know, zip of light, if you will, a ribbon of light. That's the term I'm looking for. So these examples of long exposures, we can see those ribbons of light as they cut across the screen. If we look past the train, on the very bottom right corner, you can actually see a sign of a business. So what I like about this is the fact that the train is moving so fast that we're not going to be getting a still picture of the train. We get these light ribbons and patterns that show that something went past this gentleman at great speed, but we don't necessarily see what that is. But because the train is moving fast enough that we can see through the train, through those little slits in between the train, naturally we can actually see the building behind it. And because the building behind it doesn't move, as this long exposure is going, the camera is able to pick up and receive the back of that building to great detail. So the sign, all that stuff that are behind it, we're able to see all of that, which I think is really cool and unique with the long exposures. So another thing that you can get with long exposure is mood, movement, a little more excitement to add to your arsenal, especially if you're dealing with shutter priority or if you're someone who gravitates more towards using the shutter option on your camera. So why use shutter priority? This is probably why I get photos like this all the time where a customer will come in and say, my camera doesn't work. This is the type of pictures it took. It's not true. It's not necessarily true. I mean, we could have a different conversation. It might be that case. But for the majority, if you've got images that look like this and are constantly coming out like this, and you're, at your son's or daughter's track meets or baseball games or, they play hockey. I get a lot of parents who come for hockey games. They want cameras to take pictures for their kids and for the team. You're doing any kind of sports, anything with movement in it, you should be using the shutter priority. You should be using your S or your AV on the camera, depending on what you have. That's going to give you access to the shutter. The shutter is important because with the shutter, we control the speed at which those guys close and open. So when we have things like sports, we can use the 1 in 1,000th shutter speed in order to make sure that we get these guys who are playing ultimate frisbee, or they're playing football, they're playing some sort of game, soccer maybe even, but it looks like frisbee just from the image itself. We can get those guys in much more clear detail without getting so much blur and movement. Now, seeing that there's blur of the surroundings too and everything, this photo to me always made me laugh because it makes me feel like the person who's taking the picture is like doing one of these while they're trying to shoot. It just doesn't make any sense. So stabilizing yourself, using the correct shutter speed, those are all important things. Shutter priority is for somebody who has objects that are moving at great speeds or moving at varied speeds, and they want to make sure that they can lock into that speed to get the best photo possible. So this is a great example of using at least 1 in 1,000th of a shutter speed. You see all the detail on the motorcycle, on the cyclist, you see the coloration coming behind it. If they're using a shutter speed only priority, they're probably doing a 1 in 1,000th. If not, they're probably using something a little bit faster than that because it is a dirt bike, it's moving at great speed. And these guys that do the tricks are probably only in the sky for a couple seconds at most, maybe 3 to 4 seconds. So very quick shot, has to be timed right in order to get the detail that you're looking for. And if you use any different type of shutter speed that's slower than 1,000th of a second, then you're probably not going to get this image in the detail that you want it to have. Now, ISO. ISO now is a completely different subject, but it's all part of that exposure triangle. Anybody who shot with film back in the day or still shoots with film, they might be used to the fact that their film has a number on there. That's the grain count on the film. So when I would buy film, I always like to buy Ilford 400 or Kodak 400. It's a very traditional film. That's the grain count on the film. That's its ISO. That's its exposure level. Back in film day, whatever film you got, that was the number that was in the camera. That's your ISO. Your ISO is 400. Your ISO is 100. Your ISO is 800. As now with digital cameras, because you're able to set your camera to whatever you want it to be for the ISO or let the camera run an auto ISO, we don't necessarily think about that in the same way because you're not deliberately going to the store to buy said roll of film. All of your film technically is already into your digital camera. Your SD card is what does the saving. ISO is going to equate to the darkness and how your camera is able to take and absorb the light that is around it. So when we look at the camera, when we look at the top left corner and we look at the ISO 100, you can see it's dark in the image. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of light. We got this beautiful sunset behind the bridge, but we're kind of muted on that. We've got intense shadow on this. It's very dark. We move over to 200 and we can see more light behind that bridge. There's more light on the sand of the shore. We can make that out a little bit better. The darkness that's falling from the shadow from the bridge to the water is a little less harsh. So we're starting to kind of cut back a little bit. 400, in my opinion, is a perfect image. It's magnifique. You've got beautiful light behind the physical bridge. You've got good coloration of the purples, the yellows, the reds. The shadow underneath the bridge is not nearly that strong or intense, but it's still there. So you know that there's a cool drop shadow coming in, reflection off the water, looks clean. Then you can see the beach. 800, we really get saturated. In my opinion, we start to the brightness of the sky is a little too bright. We don't have that's my biggest concern with that one. I feel like now we're whitewashing the photo too much with the amount of light that's coming through. I look at underneath the bridge and I look at where like those parts of the bridge come through to make the X's on the bottom part of it. And they almost feel like they're starting to get washed away by the light that comes through those. And I think that that adds to the photo. And I think it's really apparent in 400 and 200. So in my opinion, the best two out of these four would be the 200 or the 400. And that's all up to the photographer, and that's your discretion. You can always use auto ISO if this is something that you don't want to use. And like always, you can just use the automatic setting on your camera and let that do all the work. But if you're somebody who really wants to make sure that, number one, you're getting the full advantage of the manual settings and controls, you might benefit from using full manual. Or you might benefit from using an aperture shutter priority, turning off auto ISO, then being able to control the way that your camera understands and processes light. Now there's another way that your camera processes light, that's exposure compensation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. ISO, though, also equates to noise. We have to keep that in mind when we're taking photos. When we shoot with ISO 100, that's kind of your baseline for ISO. It starts at 100. ISO 100 will basically take the most minimum amount of light that the camera can to process that image, and by doing that, it makes the image less grainy. Grain comes from the fact that the camera is absorbing a certain amount of light. Too much light makes the sensor feel like it's got sand sprinkled all over the top of it. Too little light and you can't see anything, it looks too dark. Now in this case we have the same image. We've taken two pictures and then we've cropped them together. On the left side you have ISO 100. That's a clean image. When you look at it, you really don't see any noise, you don't see blur, you don't see distortion. It looks nice. When you look at ISO 3200, which would be one of the highest ISOs that you can do on, I would say, intro level DSLRs or mirrorless, there are, I mean, Sony has cameras that go all the way up to 250,000 ISO. They do amazing for low light situations, etc. Everybody's different on what they need their camera for, and I think that's also something to keep in mind with it. Personally, when I shoot, my camera is always at 800 ISO. I like the feel and the grit of film, so I don't mind when I have a little bit of noise come through. Now, obviously at 3200 for my ISO, I probably wouldn't want to use that. That's too much noise on my photo. So again, it's a battle that you're picking when you're doing this. It comes from experience and playing with it. The more ISO that you put on when the image is darker, the less grain you're going to get because the camera needs all the light it can to get the image out. Now, the more light that you have, the more ISO you put on, that's where you're going to run into those problems, and you're going to get the graininess from it. Auto ISO, when to use it. I would recommend, as I do with almost everybody, always use auto ISO. It's a lot easier, it's a lot simpler, unless there's a certain number that you really like for myself, I love 800. If I'm doing a professional-based piece where I'm not trying to get grain, I will then move it to 100 and turn my grain count low in my camera settings. But if I'm shooting for myself, like for example, St. Patrick's Day is coming up this Saturday. I love going downtown to watch it. I always bring my camera with me because I love taking photos of people enjoying the river being dyed and the festivities, and it's just so much fun to me to have the camera to capture that excitement in the city. Because it's my personal camera, I'm not taking these photos for anything other than my own personal enjoyment to just show that I enjoyed my weekend. My ISO is probably going to be around 800 for the entirety of it. And I'll probably shoot in almost full automatic. That's me personally. But auto ISO, great time to use it. I get the parents who come in that are doing homecoming photos, and they're telling me that their kid is going to be taking pictures indoors and outdoors. What do they recommend for settings? And that's when I will tell them to use auto ISO. Because now you're switching between your environments. You're going between places that'll have a lot of light, not a lot of light, a lot of light, not a lot of light. Basement. living room with windows, outdoors. You've got all these different settings and environments. Reflection comes into this. The intensity that we see in certain reflections can play a part in how ISO is affected. Using auto ISO makes your life a lot easier, where you don't have to sit there and necessarily try to control every little bit. If I was doing a homecoming shoot for somebody, I probably would do an aperture priority setting, so that way I'm able to dictate whether or not the background and the foreground matter so much. Maybe I can put more blur on the background and really focus in on the foreground where my two prom dates are standing, or where, you know, the group is lined up in front of the limo or somebody's nice house. That's when using auto ISO would be a really appropriate idea. So when you're going in between different locations that have different amount of lights, and you don't have time to really, or you don't have time to sit there and try to figure out what ISO is best. So to review on everything, we talked about f-stop in the beginning. The lower the number in f-stop, the more background blur you're going to get. The closer to that 1.4, 1.8, 1.2 that we get, the more bokeh effect we can get, which comes in with light. When light is introduced into a photo, the light can get turned into dots, bokeh dots. Those bokeh dots are famous because they can really help add to an image by taking the light and making it very rudimentary, making it all circular, and making it flat to the back of your image. Looks really cool and effective if it's done right. As you start moving up, though, with the photos that I have there, we've got pigs. It's two little stuffed piggies. They're sitting on a couch in someone's living room. 1.4, the background is pretty blurred. We can make out what the information is, but not truly that much. Once you get to f16, though, you can see there's a pillow behind those guys. It looks like the corner of a fireplace. We see the corner of the wall of their home, and then we also see the pigs. So f-stop, the lower the number, the more we blur the background out. The higher the number, the more we accommodate for both the background and the foreground. The reason we should be looking at aperture and f-stop is because it's what controls our ability to blur the background to the foreground, or vice versa, to blur the foreground to the background. Shutter speed is next. The higher the number, the faster the shutter is moving. So in the case of the swinging hammer, 1 1,000th of a second is enough to freeze the camera and make sure that we get the full swing in its entirety. And we get a nice clean stop on that full swing. As we move down and get slower and slower with the shutter speed, we see more blur with the image. We see more motion with the image. But the thing that we see also is that the background in the photo is getting darker. The faster, or the slower, the slower that we're doing these photos, the darker images get. The darker that the image will process as, because we're letting it stay open for a longer period of time, meaning it's able to read more of the details. So those shadows, or intense wall colors, or let's say wrinkles or lines, depending on what you're taking a picture of, they're going to show up more in a longer exposure than in a shorter exposure. When we look at the 1 1,000th, the background almost looks white. When we look at 1.5 or half a second, it looks dark. So that's another thing to keep in mind with shutter. The slower you go, obviously the more information that's picked up, but then the more blurry an image can be if there's motion involved. The faster we go, the less information that's picked up, but more kind of stopping quality, where we're freezing it in mid-action. And remember that freezing a action shot starts at a 1 1,000th or higher, or faster, I should say. Now we go down from there, we have the ISO. Now, the little squares, I think, make ISO a little harder to understand in this case, but ISO refers to how our camera breaks down and processes the light that it's presented with. ISO 100 in the left corner probably works the best for this image. The countertop that this little penny is sitting on is nice and dark. We see all the wood grain, we see the wrinkles, it looks right. Penny itself also looks detailed, it has all the information. You can see the wrinkle or the crease, or the little scratch through it, and the little scuffs. As you keep moving to the right for ISO, things start to get grainier, they start to get lighter, they get more washed out. ISO is perfect to be, or ISO is important when we're talking about how light is in the area. If you're in an area that's dark, dim lit, and let's say suburbs are notorious. I'm from Chicago, by the way, everybody, but the suburbs are notorious for not having street lights. Let's say you are at the park and there was one street light on. You don't want to use ISO 100. The image will come out too dark. You probably want to go closer to 2500. I would probably say 1000 or 640 in this case, maybe 1600. 2500 might be a little too dark, given because you do have a nice bright street light. But what you're doing there is you're reading the environment to understand what would be the best bet. Now, if that's something that annoys you and you don't really want to have to do with that, that's when auto ISO is great to deal with, because then you don't have to worry about it. The camera will focus on how much light it reads and meters all of that for you. All you need to either do is do full automatic, point, shoot the camera, or do a shutter or aperture priority, or do full manual as well. You have those options. ISO's great. ISO's fun to play with, but it can get tricky and it can become frustrating. So viewer discretion with that one. Now, I talked about ISO, and I think the next thing that we can really talk about is the exposure meter. Now, exposure meter and ISO are two very different things. Your ISO is what your camera does to understand your surroundings light. It takes the light that's absorbed and pushed back by all these different things. It attracts the light, puts it into the camera body, kind of like when a bad guy in a superhero movie like steals somebody's power, they like take it away from them. That's kind of what the ISO does. It sees the light in the area and it takes that light and it says it's going to use it for the photo. Now, one of the other tricks that cameras have is exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is where you turn this dial on the camera and will either lighten or darken the photo based on the ISO that you have. So some people, to get around having to change their ISO constantly, what they'll do is they'll keep it at ISO 100. And while they're shooting, they'll say, oh, the image is still a little bit dark. Let me change my exposure compensation. They'll bring it a stop or two stops down or up, depending. The lower that you go, the darker it becomes. The higher that you go, the lighter it becomes. So again, every brand does it a little bit differently, and they have this dial in a different place. Some people will say 0 and then do tick marks. Other people will do this home plate looking shape and then do 1s plus 2s or -2s or -1s, that sort of thing. It's a great way to cheat, to play with the light. Like for me, I always shoot on ISO 800. So I like my things look as close to film as possible. By doing that, I need to constantly change my exposure meter, exposure compensation, so that way I'm making sure that my photo is either a little bit lighter or a little bit darker to adjust for the room's ISO, or to adjust for the room's actual lighting. That's why I would do it. Now, full manual is going to give you control over both the aperture and the shutter speed. If you are brand spanking new to photography and you've never done anything before, I can't stress automatic enough, because I think that it really does the trick and gives you everything that you need. However, for those who've done it, they understand it. We've talked maybe about some tips and tricks, and anybody who's interested, by all means, just always reach out to me. I can always answer questions after class or about other things. But I teach students how to shoot in automatic and then check their camera to see what the camera decided to take the picture as. So if you're brand spanking new, I tell people to do is start with automatic. Shoot through the image. Go into image playback. When you're looking through the photos that you took, there's always an info button on the camera. If you can find the info button, which is all in the layout of the physical buttons on the camera, it should break down a bunch of different pieces of information. On most mirrorless cameras nowadays, you can get access to a histogram. The histogram will show you the lightest point, the darkest point, and then the middle, and then how your whole thing works from there. And it'll give you this little graph that goes up and down in crazy ways, because it breaks down the image's lightest and darkest points, and it shows you on a graph. I don't use that nearly as much. I know I should, because it'll help break down how I'm viewing light and how I review color and how that all interacts. But what I like is the fact that when I go through the info another time, it'll actually show me what my aperture is, what my shutter is, what my ISO is. It'll also tell me the date and the time I took that photo, which that part doesn't matter. But using that as a beginning photographer, you really can start to learn what it is about the automatic settings that's giving you the better photos. Hopefully by doing this enough, you get the education to say, wow, well, it's a sunny day. When I took this photo the other day and it was sunny, I used the f-stop of 32 because I really didn't need to worry about blurring out the background. I just needed a clean photo, and I used ISO 100. I think that's what I'll set my camera to for this one. Now you're getting into full manual settings where you can now control all this stuff and you know what to look for. So full manual is great. I definitely would recommend it, but using what you basically got before should help you decide how to set things now. So now this is the part of the class where I go through and I'm going to show you these photos and I'm going to break down what I'm seeing and what this means. So to start, I have this bridge shot that I've used for a bunch. To start, the photo itself, it looks kind of dark outside. So just by seeing how dark this is, I imagine that the ISO's turned up to at least 400, maybe 600 or 800. From there, we've got pretty good background to foreground, not separation, but togetherness. So I imagine the f-stop is somewhere around that 32 mark. We're not really trying to blur the background out in this case. We're trying to just get a nice wide angle shot of this whole section. As far as shutter speed goes, I see a lot of detail and coloration on the brick. From the image that I'm seeing, there's a lot of detail on there. So my imagination would be that this was shot with a tripod and held open with a longer exposure, a longer shutter speed. So it's hard to say what the shutter speed could be. It could be half a second. Also could be 1 1/100th of a second. It could be there. But definitely was done with a shorter or a longer shutter speed that was not quick. Coloration looks great though, not a lot of blurriness. I see a little bit of graininess in certain parts where the pillars are that are coming across for the bridge. If you look underneath there, you'll see a little bit of grain on there, and I imagine that the ISO is a little too high for that. But the ISO being turned up that way, you can kind of see that the sky isn't necessarily dark, and this is definitely shot at nighttime. So the sky being a little bit lighter definitely means that a higher ISO is used. The bricks being in detail like they are signifies that we probably had a longer shutter speed. And then as far as an f-stop goes, we were probably, again, using something like an f32 because we have both the foreground and the background in pretty clear detail. Here we have some cherry blossoms. When we look at the cherry blossoms, it's the main branch that's in front of our eyes. The two branches, one's going this way, the other one's kind of curving in on itself. That is definitely going to be something with a lower ISO. Let's start with at least 100 ISO on there, maybe 200. Shot in the daytime, shot outdoors, not a lot of reason to be putting a lot of heavy ISO on there. Now as far as the f-stop goes, we definitely have some blurring going on here, right? We can't see the background nearly as well. But what we do see is the front branches there in front of us. So background to foreground separation. Background is probably separated to maybe like a 18, maybe f18. It's definitely somewhere that's not necessarily making it where we can't make out at all what the background is, but it's blurring it out so that our main focus is drawn to the branches in front of us. Now, as far as shutter goes, I can't imagine that this was held open for too long. There's not a lot of detail on the flower. The flowers look a smidge flat. So my imagination is that this was a quicker shutter speed just to get the image. Could have been a windy day, so maybe the branches were going back and forth, so they just wanted to make it quick. We've got our fireman here. Front fireman is in perfect detail. We can make out his face, we can tell who he is, and we see him. When we look at the guy behind him though, we can't see anything on that guy. He's blurry, he's not as detailed. So if I really had to put my thumb on it, f-stop is probably somewhere similar to the cherry blossom one we were looking at, like an f18, f10, where we're breaking down the background so it blurs out a little bit, but not enough that we can't make out what the background actually is. As far as shutter goes, unless they're walking or they're moving, they're probably using a little bit faster than 1/100th of a second just because of the detail there. And then as far as ISO goes, there's not a lot of grain on this photo, so probably at least 100 to 200 for ISO. So again, nothing over the top, nothing that would make the photo too grainy, but nothing that would oversaturate the photo to make it look too light. We got the ram's head here. The ram's head is in really good detail, and I'm always a little confused by this one because just judging by the detail on the ram's horns, I imagine that this was something that was either shot with a really detailed, heavy megapixel camera. I'm talking too much now with that, but shutter is probably a little bit quicker because this is an animal, so it can move. So shutter is probably 1/200th at the worst, 1/100th probably at the best. F-stop is definitely going to have some sort of blur to it because you can see that the background is slightly blurred, but not nearly as blurred as the last image. So where you can see the background, but you can't see the guy behind him. So like, if you knew who this gentleman was, you wouldn't know who his buddy is unless you could make out that face shape. In this image, in the next image, we can clearly see that that's the base of a tree, branches, and some snow on the ground, but we can't see it clearly enough to maybe count how many branches are on the floor. That's probably more of a F24, maybe F20, where you can clearly kind of see what it is, but you can't see the finer details on it. The RAM itself, like I said, the movement's probably not that fast, but because it's a living animal, it's moving, and RAMs can at any point in time start charging. So again, probably 1/100th, 1/200th. ISO wise though, I imagine this was real low. I do see some grain in the horn where the blue on the horn is coming through, so that bottom right, or bottom left, yes, the bottom left corner where the horn kind of comes up. I can see a little bit of graininess there. But ISO I probably would put a little lower to maybe 1/100th. Or, sorry, 100 ISO. Now we got some motion catches here. These were definitely done with a shutter speed of 1/1000th or higher. You got two dogs. If anybody's thrown a frisbee to their pet before, the frisbee's going fast, your pet's going fast, they take off in the air. It's a cool thing to watch. So this guy takes pictures of dogs as they're playing in the park. You've got dog on the left. Background is almost completely blurred. You can't make that background out. I imagine that that's a bunch of trees and bushes and then a row of cars because we're at a dog park of some sort. But clearly, you can't make out that that's the shape or body of a car. So f-stop could be a 1.8, could be a 2, could be a 2.8 depending on what the camera guy had. Shutter speed's fast, 1/1000th at least, or even faster. From there, we're looking at probably an ISO of about 100. I mean, it's outdoors. There's no need to blast the ISO any higher than that. Nothing's washed out, but I don't think ISO's that high on this one. Going to the right image, I would probably say the same thing, except for the background to foreground separation's a little less, so I probably wouldn't say 2.8 or 1.4. I probably would say maybe like a f-stop of 5 or 6, where background's blurred out, but you can still clearly make out some of the branches behind there, the grass field, all of that. Dog catching it in midair, definitely 1/1000th, and ISO probably also in the same ballpark, 100 ISO, 200 ISO. Just because you're outdoors, you don't need that strong of an ISO. And it's sunny outside, so you really don't need that strong of an ISO. And then I think this is one of the last ones I have, but the football player jumping in the end zone. He's going at pretty good speed, dives in for the touchdown. We can see the football player clearly. We can make out all of the wrinkles and folds on his muscle. We can see the turf springing up as he jumps in, all the pieces of rubber that's underneath the turf. When we look at the background, we see that the players that missed the tackle are slightly blurry. So f-stop probably isn't a 1.4 or 1.8 because we can clearly make out the helmets. We can see the body parts pretty well of those players. We see his arms are curled up. We see the other guy's leg and arm as he's kind of cutting across. So for me, that's probably like a 10 or an 8. maybe a little higher than that, just because you can make it out, but it's still blurred, maybe like a 12 or 16. As far as ISO is concerned, I probably would say 200, 300. There's some shadows that are on the field itself, and you can see that where the sun is positioned, it's basically over the top of him, just on where the shadow's lying on the floor there. So again, ISO doesn't really need to be that high either. And then as far as shutter speed goes, definitely 1 in 1,000s, possibly higher, or possibly faster, because he is moving at such a fast pace to make a touchdown that you're going to want to have some speed on that. This is the last one. So this is a long exposure shot, and it took me a while to figure that out, but if you look down below, you can see that there are streaks of light ribbons coming from the train. On top of that too, the fact that the lights are so bright that they almost make like a starlight look, that would tell me that the ISO is much higher as well. That it was a longer exposure. There's a lot of detail on the bike, on the peg of the bike, on the physical writing on the bike. All of that stuff has a lot of detail to it, and so that makes me feel like this was done as a longer exposure. On top of that too, the graininess of the sky looks a little heavy. So because of that, I imagine the ISO was set higher and it shouldn't have been. So that's something I'm picking up from this. As far as what ISO, I mean, it looks pretty washed out, but maybe this would be an 800 or 1,000 ISO, maybe even closer to 3,200, around that range, but it's not grainy enough that I feel like that's necessary. So I probably would say about 1,200 ISO. Shutter speed, obviously, longer exposure, like I said. An f-stop, this would probably be fully open. The background's slightly blurry, but I don't think that's from the f-stop. I would think that that's from basically everything else with the camera. Now, learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. Anyone can learn it. And I mean that. I have people that come in that can tell me every spec about a camera under the sun. They know every detail, every number spec that the camera does. They know everything. But they don't know how to take a nice picture. And I think that is, at the end of the day, something that you'll see a lot of people. They love to nerd out about the details, but when it comes to the actual practice to how do you get the best photo, that's where I see people struggle, and that's where I see people lack the creativity. Learning your camera is great, and I applaud you for doing that. If you come into my store and you know every button and every thing, and you've got very specific questions, I like that, because I can tell you've done your homework. You're coming in here to really try to learn or get at something. What I don't like is when you come in with all that information, and then you come in with these photos that just don't look good. You're clearly there to learn the information, to learn the knowledge, but you're not really there to put all of that to the test to make sure you get the best image quality. And that's something that I try to help people understand. That's something we do in the basic class to start, is how to shoot through the image, how to frame things up and make things look nice. So what I basically mean is practice. Get out there, use your camera. I'm so big on wherever I go, I have my camera with me at all times. Some people laugh at me for it. They're like, what are you going to take pictures of while we're at, the dump? Or, we're at a landfill. What are you taking pictures of? I'll figure it out. I have it. That's the most important part. I'm using the camera for its primary function, which is to take photos, to document, to have things to look back on, or to show others. Best camera accessories is practice, classes, YouTube channels you love, workshops, and travel. If you take your camera outdoors once a week and you shoot for 45 minutes and you just shoot anything, you practice your f-stops, you practice your shutter, you practice your ISO, you will become a better photographer in a 2-week, 3-week period. And the only reason I say that is because you are practicing and using the camera to its fullest ability. You're getting more comfortable with your shots, but you're also learning as you go. As any photographer will teach you, it's all about your eyes, and it's all about how you see things and how you perceive. As an artist, you are basically making a creation that then gets perceived through the eyes of others. They will not look at something the same way you look at it, and vice versa. They're going to look at something and you're going to look at it completely different. But the goal is that you want to basically make your photos and your work look the way or feel the way that you want it to look. And that in its own way should help convey the importance and the message to the person that you're showing. Practice. Bring your camera with you when you go to the park with the kids. Bring your camera with you when you're at the office and you've got free time. During your lunch break, walk around and take pictures of the treetops. If you're living downtown, you've got plenty to take pictures of. If you live in the rural country, you can take a picture of a different tree every single day and figure it out. It's good to practice. Keep taking classes. You should always be a perpetual student. The worst thing you can do is pretend that you know it all. There are new things coming out with cameras on a regular basis that I don't even know about. I get things that customers will bring up to me that I've never had somebody ask, and I've never even thought of asking myself. Those are things that are very valuable. Keep learning, keep doing classes. YouTube is great. It's probably the best resource out there to learn. If you are brand new to this, type in your camera model and type in 10 things you didn't know about, the Sony A7, the Canon Rebel T7, the Nikon D780. You can learn all about these things. And they'll give you some information that I won't know, that you probably don't know, but now you do. Workshops are great too. I have a lot of people who come in here who are part of clubs and workshops where their whole thing is to take photos and then compete against each other in a gallery juror competition by their peers. It's really awesome and a lot of fun, and you get a lot of good feedback from that. And travel is the big one. If you are leaving the state, the country, the world, I don't care where you're going, and you don't have a camera with you, I think that you're doing it wrong. You might never get to travel to where you're getting to go again, and just bringing your phone, you'll regret that you didn't bring a real camera, because what you can get with a real camera versus your phone is much more. And if you don't know how to use a camera, traveling with a camera is one of the quickest ways to figure it out. Other recommended accessories, and when I talk to people about this, the 3 things that you will need is a camera, camera body, a lens, and a strap. 4 things. Camera body, lens, strap, and an SD card. Those are the only 4 things that you need to get started. Personally, that's a great way to start. If that's all you have, that should get you through years of taking photos. From there though, get a bag. Store that stuff. Be safe with it. Don't let it fall. Be gentle with it. Lenses are worth a lot of money. They're expensive, but lenses are also so valuable. I've got a quote in here that I'll read a little bit later that kind of sums all that up. Get an extra bag and a memory card. You should always have extra batteries and extra memory cards just because things can go wrong. A lens cleaning kit. I do the Chicago Polar Plunge every year. I volunteer. I take photos for it. If I don't have a lens cleaning kit in my pocket when people are jumping into the lake and splashing me, especially in cold, freezing, wet January weather, it's not a good time. Have your tripod. You should have the tripod that the camera's going to sit on, and then that way you can do your long exposure, or you can take photos and not necessarily have to worry about jiggling or wiggling. External hard drives for storage of photos, the polarizing filters that you can get, ND filters. I don't go into detail about filters. I can always answer questions about them later. Do some research on filters online. Go on YouTube and type in the difference between camera filters, and you should get some really cool things. They make some really awesome effect filters out there too, where you can get swirls, get the James Bond look on photos, that like gun barrel photo type thing. There's so many different filters out there that you can get that will add on to your camera ability. And additional lenses, and we're going to talk a little bit about the lenses next, but those are all things that you should be looking at as someone who's just starting when you're trying to think about what other things do I need. Date your body, marry your glass. That is the age-old saying in camera world. Your glass is valuable. It is, some of these lenses cost $6,000 to $7,000 because of the glass and the material that goes into it. If you're going to go out and you're going to spend money on a brand new camera, I would say 80% of what you're spending should go to the lens and 20% to the body. Your camera body, it's like a car. Once you drive your car off the lot, you've lost money. Once you start and take one picture with the camera, the shutter count now went up 1. And that means that you are now how many more pictures away from your camera's shutters not performing to the best ability. With that being said, you will oftentimes replace your camera body more than your lenses. Your lenses, if you're doing it right and taking good care of them, your lenses will continue to be transferable down the road. People that bought a Rebel or bought the 1XD or bought, we can even look at Nikon. People who bought the D780 or the D7500, any of the D series cameras, any of Canon's T series and DSLRs, just because Nikon and Canon made 2 new mounting systems, you can still bring all your old lenses over. I have people who come in all the time just to buy the adapter to convert their old lenses to their new body cameras. Now they've got this gorgeous collection of lenses that, each lens was a couple $1,000s or, just what they could afford for the time. Now they don't have to sit there and buy all new glass. They just buy a brand spanking new camera body that's so powerful. They bring in this really nice glass that they already have bought, and they've got a gorgeous camera set up, and they didn't have to go through and replace everything. So it's important that you take good care of your glass on your lenses, and you remember that your lenses will last for longer than your body will. So marry your lens, date your body. Focal length and zoom, they both acquaint to each other, and I think that's really important to remember. Now, when we talk about cameras, some people will talk about the optical zoom length. Is it 10 times zoom? Is it 43 times zoom? That is, in my opinion, sometimes an arbitrary number, and I have a really hard time articulating that to people because in the camera world, we go by millimeters. So when we look at this image, we have a 70 millimeter lens, we have a 105, 200, and 400. As we go through the differences between them, we see that the birds or the group of seagulls or gulls that we're taking pictures of gets closer to us. Focal length acquaints to zoom. The higher your focal length goes, the more zoom that you have. Typically, I see lenses tap out around 600 when they're a variable zoom, so when they go from like 100 to 600, that's where I see them tap out at, is about that 6. Canon has a lens that's an 800 millimeter fixed zoom. I've seen Nikons that have a 700 zoom. You can find lenses out there that zoom real far, and you can get converters to make them even go further. But focal length, when we're looking at lenses, acquaints to zoom. Focal length also can contribute to compression. We talked about JPEGs being a compressed photo file, and RAW being something that has more layers, like an onion, to quote Shrek. In the case of focal length and compression, when we have a smaller focal length, like a 16 millimeter, a 20 millimeter, 25, 35, I'd say 50 is the only exception. Those are all going to give us more of a pinhead-like experience. So when we look at this GIF, we can see that when it gets to the smaller numbers, the nose extends forward, his eyes push back, and hat pushes forward. It makes his head look very thin and narrow. When we get to the bigger numbers, his jaw becomes more rectangular and square, and his face becomes more plump. That's because the numbers are starting to sink back. Our line of sight now changes, and so because of that, we're seeing this as a little bit different. 50 millimeters is your true perfect portrait. If you buy what they call a nifty 50, and we're going to talk about lenses later on, you will take a clean picture and a perfect portrait of whoever your subject matter is. So focal length acquaints to zoom, but we have to remember that focal length and compression go hand in hand. And when we get to some of these higher numbers, we make things look fatter. And when we get to the lower numbers, we make things look skinnier. Again, it's all different when we're doing things, and we have to choose the best lens that's best for the subject that we're taking pictures of. So if people are involved, 35, 50, 75, 100, perfect lens sizes for the perfect portrait. 50 being the most perfect, 35 being the lowest, 100 being your highest, 75 and 50 kind of being like the perfect way to go about that. So what lenses do you actually need when you're looking at this? I usually tell people that the lenses that you should be looking at, the kit lens is always number one. The kit lens that you're getting with your camera is typically the best way to get started with it so you can understand what lenses and what you like to take pictures of. But let's say you're not new to this, you've had your lenses, you're the intermediate class after all, you probably want to look at some different lenses. So a kit lens to start will look something typically like this. Usually you get something that's wide angle to more of a portrait. So in this case we have 18 to 55 millimeters. That's going to be your wide angle to some sort of portrait. But when we look at the f-stop, it starts at a 3.5, so we can't even get to that 1.8, 1.4 number that we were talking about earlier to get the bokeh and the background effect. But from 3.5, as we move from 18, if we're at our lowest aperture setting, it'll go from 3.5 to 5.6 by the time we get to 55 millimeters. So it's something to keep in mind. You're getting a lens to start off, but it's usually a lens that doesn't give you the best aperture priority, nor will it give you the best, it really just doesn't give you the best aperture priority, if I'm being honest. Everything else is pretty good. My first lens that I tell people to go for is the Nifty 50. It's my favorite lens. If anything, this should be the next lens that you buy after your kit lens. Now, it's all depending on what you take photos of, but if you're interested at all of taking pictures of your pets, your kids, your relatives, your friends, anybody that's a person or some type of living creature, the 50 millimeter is the way to go. The least amount of distortion, no zoom, but it gives you a very clean photo. And typically when you're looking to buy one of these lenses, you can get an f2.8, which is a pretty low f-stop, for $300 to $400, which is a pretty reasonable price when looking at some of these. When this specific Nifty 50 retails for probably about $1,500–$1,600 because it's one of Sony's top of the line ones. The next thing you should be looking about with what lenses you need are prime versus zoom lenses. A prime lens is a single number. Our 50 millimeter is a great example of a prime lens. 50 is all it stays at. It cannot move from 50 millimeter. Always will be a 50. Our kit lens will be variable, so it'll be what you call a telephoto. And if you want to get more specific, we can call this a minor telephoto. Then there's super telephoto. Minor telephoto, 18 to 55, means that it can telephoto out, it expands, it changes its size, but not to a great distance. 18 to 55 isn't that much. The 50 will never move from 50. It'll always be a 50 millimeter. This is the Trinity. My screen is over here, so I'm pointing at it over this side. But this is what you should be looking at as a photographer. If you are brand new to this, if you're a veteran, there are basically 3 lenses that you should own. And I kind of goofed this up, but we're going to say that the one in the bottom right corner is a 50 millimeter lens. It's not a variable zoom. The top lens that I have is a 16 to 35. That is going to be my kind of walking around street photography lens. I'm going to get semi-wide angle with the 16, tighten it up and get 35, which isn't necessarily a perfect portrait, but to get pictures of people, it'll actually slim them down a little bit. And I think that overall, people always say that when they're on camera, the camera adds 10 pounds on. Something like a 35 millimeter should make people look really nice, but regardless, it's a good walking around lens to get some sort of zoom without getting a lot of zoom. Now, to counteract that, you've got a 70 to 200 from Nikon below that. That's a great zoom lens. That's for the type of person that is ready to take a picture of the bald eagle that's flying across. Or, in this case, I'm standing next to my atrium section. I can see the fountain below me. Maybe there's somebody running around the fountain and I want to get a cool picture of that. I could change and zoom in to get as close to my subject matter as possible. That's what then that would be. And then the bottom right corner would be your Nifty 50. That would be your 50 millimeter lens for perfect portraits. So you basically have your low numbers, your high number, and then your middle prime lens. That is considered the holy trinity of lenses, and that is considered what every photographer should have in their arsenal. Now, people will get different variations of it. They'll get the cheap ones to start, they'll upgrade, they'll buy the more expensive, they'll sell off their cheap ones to a starter. You can go multiple ways of doing this. But yes, this is the Trinity. Now, there's one other lens that I talk about That's the travel lens. For those who are going on safari, they're going to different countries, they're going on a cruise, you might not want to carry around 4 or 5 lenses with you, or 3 different lenses. A travel lens is great. What you sacrifice with the travel lenses are low f-stops. You cannot get a lens like this with a low f-stop. But what you get is a lens that'll go from a very low number to a very high number. I've seen them go from 18 to 200. This lens in particular is an 18 to 135. So you got 18 wide angle. You can get 50 for portrait, 75 for portrait, but then you can go to 100 if you see that bird flying across the sky and you want to get better detail of it. So a travel lens is great for those who are trying to go out of the country or do stuff and they don't want to have to carry a lot of bulky equipment with them. And that is it, everybody. That was my first class standing like that, but it definitely helped me not yawn so much, so I appreciate that. But thanks, guys, for staying on. I went a little over time, but this class usually takes the longest of all 3 of my camera classes. But thanks for sticking around for this. You've got my email, you've got my phone number there. My name is Saxon. Like I said earlier, I teach cameras here at Apt. I'm the assistant manager for small electronics, and I'm pretty knowledgeable when it comes to cameras and all video-esque type things, even editing softwares. If people have questions, you can ask me. I can do my best. We'll be taking a break for the next couple of weeks because this was the 2nd Thursday of the month. So technically I have 2 Thursdays off. So what I would recommend is anybody who feels like they need more from me, that this isn't enough, I'm in store till about 6 o'clock on the 16th and the 23rd, which are the next 2 Thursdays. What I'd recommend is if anybody has questions, that'd be a great time to come on in, bring your camera, and I can answer personal questions on a one-on-one fashion, or I can answer questions on really anything that you might have. And if I don't know something, we can always figure out the answer. But I will be back teaching classes on the 30th. So 3 Thursdays from now will be the final Thursday of the month. I'll be teaching drones. So the basics of how to fly drones, how to be doing videos with drones, that sort of stuff. So if you are interested in that, by all means, love to have you. But yeah, that's all I got for you guys. So I'll keep this open for a few more minutes. Earlier in the class, the protege, he asked, what is this? And it's a camera class. We teach them for beginner photographers, intermediate photographers. I'm debating about doing an advanced photography class and maybe adding a 4th Thursday of the month to this. It seems like I have more people asking about editing and what to do with that. So I'm thinking about moving into that. If you guys have comments on that one, please comment on the video. Would love to get feedback about doing something like that. And if there's anything else you think I should be adding to these classes. I do teach the same class every month, and I've been doing so for the past maybe 6-7 months now. So I'm always down to add and spruce things up. So please, if anybody ever has any recommendations to what could be added to these camera classes to maybe help, or questions or things they think would be intermediate or beginner questions to ask that I'm not answering, throw them in there. I'd love to get that feedback and then start doing stuff like that. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to keep it open for a few more minutes. I'll check my emails real quick, and then I'll close out if nobody has any other questions. But I thank you guys all for watching. it doesn't look like anybody else has any other questions for me. As always, you've got my email, my phone number. If you forget it, just watch some of these videos and you'll see I always post it at the very end of every video. So thank you all for joining once again. I really do appreciate it. The only reason I keep making these videos is because I see I have so many viewers every time. So it really means a lot to me, guys, that you continue. Like and subscribe to Act Electronics if you want to hear more. And as always, I will see you guys in 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now on the 30th of March. So we will be doing drones. Have a great night, have a great day, and keep on shooting, keep on taking photos, everybody. If you ever have photos or pictures or videos or anything that you